Welcome, everyone. Tonight, you will experience a novel approach to political conversation. The Chamber and the Sooke Multi-Belief Initiative are collaborating on this evening's program. We are presenting a non-confrontational, all-candidates meeting that focuses on the candidates' personal vision for the future of our riding and our country, in addition to that of their respective parties. This is a presentation, not a debate or an argument. The presenters are to be non-confrontational. There is to be no criticism of the other individuals, their leaders, party, or other parties' policies. This is not a campaign rally. To keep the conversation non-confrontational, we are asking everyone to listen objectively to the views of all the candidates so that you may draw your own conclusions from the candidates' answers. This evening will be moderated by Maja Tait, Mayor of the District of Sooke and President of the Union of BC Municipalities. The Mayor will introduce each of the candidates. Each candidate will be asked the same 4 questions regarding social inequality, affordability and taxes, climate change, and willingness to work with other parties in government. Candidates have been asked to provide important and meaningful answers to the questions, rather than campaign slogans or general comments. Candidates have been asked to state the benefits of their proposed programs, including how many people will benefit. Speaking order will be drawn by lots, and the speaking order will be rotated with each successive question. Each candidate will be given 3 minutes to answer each question. The questions are to be answered without belittling other parties' initiatives or making comparative statements of how their initiatives are better than the other party's programs. The Mayor will interrupt the speaker if the speaker exceeds the time limit for a question, or if confrontational views are expressed, and she will stop the presentation if a candidate continues to conduct themselves inappropriately. We are asking that everyone respectfully respond to the views presented by the candidates and not voice your opposition to the candidates or others in the audience. After the formal meeting, the candidates have been asked to stay for half an hour to mingle with audience members in the lobby. We reached out to all accessible candidates at the time this event was being organized. The candidates not speaking today have been invited to answer the same 4 questions in writing, and the Chamber will distribute their responses so that all voices have the opportunity to be heard. Everyone is welcome to ask more questions of any candidates in the lobby afterwards. There are 2 thoughts I would like to leave you with before the Mayor Tait takes over. Showing kindness is strength, and different has never meant wrong. It only means different. Please welcome Mayor Maja Tait.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I wish to begin this evening by recognizing that we are meeting tonight on the traditional territory of the Sauk Nation, and we are indeed very grateful to be here. On behalf of Council, we thank all of you for taking your busy Thanksgiving Friday to participate in this important matter facing our community. So a few housekeeping items. Fire exits are to the rear and also on this side of the stage and left. If you hear an alarm, please proceed to an exit and head to the parking lot. Washrooms are down the corridor to the gymnasium. You'll find both women and men washrooms there. There's also another one to the left, out this door and to the left. Mobile devices, if you have them, please turn off your any of your ringtones or notifications. Best thing is probably to put it into airplane mode. Candidates, is Josh Steffler in the audience anywhere? Seeing none, okay. So for the candidates, Marlene Berry up front here has a timing advice. So the light will shine green until 2 minutes and 30 seconds comes, then the light will go yellow. At 3 minutes, it'll be a flashing red light, and that's when I will interrupt you if you're still speaking. So remember that you have up to 3 minutes to answer each question. And so at this time, I would like to introduce our candidates that are here this evening in alphabetical order. We're starting off with Randall Garrison. Randall was elected to the House of Commons in the 2011 federal election. He serves as the NDP critic for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgendered, and transsexual issues and for national defense. He is the candidate for the New Democratic Party. Next is Jeremy Gustafson. Jeremy is a third-generation Vancouver Islander, born in Victoria and raised in Campbell River, who spent 8 years working on his father's fishing boat from the age of 14. But now, like many ex-fishermen, he works in the film industry in Vancouver. Jeremy entered politics as an independent in 2013 and is now the candidate for the People's Party of Canada. Jamie Hammond. Jamie graduated from Esquimalt High in the University of Victoria before earning his international affairs degree from Carleton University. He has a 28-year career in the Canadian Armed Forces and went on to serve as private secretary for 2 lieutenant governors of BC. And as a senior civil servant with the provincial government. He focused on innovation and international trade, and he is the candidate for the Liberal Party. David Merner. David has earned degrees from Harvard College, the University of Alberta, Oxford University, and the University of Toronto. He was called to the bar in both British Columbia and Ontario. He advised ministers at the Department of Justice and Privy Council office in Ottawa for 15 years before moving back to BC to help reform the province's justice system. David is the candidate for the Green Party. Philip Ney. Philip attended Victoria College, graduated MD from the University of BC in 1960, and interned at the Victoria General Hospital. He led a team of professionals to consult in Hazelton, Smithers, Williams Lake, and other small communities in northern BC. He has taught at the University of BC for 22 years, the University of Hong Kong, the University of Otago, and University of Calgary, then professor at the Department of Family Practice at UBC. He ran the Child Psychiatric Services at Royal Jubilee Hospital and then Ledger House. Philip is an independent candidate. Josh isn't here, so I'm moving to Tyson Strandlund. A lifetime resident of Vancouver Island, Tyson is presently working towards completing his MA at UVic in Cultural, Social, and Political Thought, having received his BA in History. Tyson has a history of activism in a variety of areas, including the anti-racist, peace, environmental, and student movements. He plays an organizing role in student strikes and rallies against tuition hikes, and he is the candidate for the Communist Party. So if we could give a round of applause, please, to all of our candidates. Okay, at this time we're going to draw for speaking orders, so I'd like to call Mark Ziegler up to draw the numbers.
I got one. Second in the back. Oh, that's bad.
Oh, let's get her bad with the groans.
Is there a laptop in here?
Okay, number one,
I'm number one.
Jamie. Okay,
The Navy is a senior service.
and number two, Tyson. 3, Jeremy. 4, Philip. 5, David. So that, Randall. Okay. So the way this will work is that I'll read out each question, and then each candidate will answer the question up to 3 minutes. Question number 2, the candidate who is second will start next. Third question will lead off with number 3, 4, and that'll be it. And then, of course, you'll have plenty of time to mingle in the lobby afterwards. So I'm going to read the first question. It'll also show up on the screen above me. The first one is on social inequality. The gap between the rich and poor in our country is steadily increasing, and access to essential resources such as healthcare, education, and other social services are unequally distributed in our society. What are your party's plans to create a more fair and equitable society, ensuring the needs and potential of our First Nations, youth, families, and elderly are met? Welcome.
So, good evening. Thank you all for being here. It's incredible, the numbers. It's fantastic to see that commitment to democracy and to thinking about this. I spent a career in the military. I was a private secretary. I worked in the BC government. And I reflected a lot on what kind of society do we want. And I saw societies fall apart in places like Afghanistan and places like Bosnia, very advanced civilized societies that fell apart. And part of it was that social inequality. And so when I started thinking about running for office, I asked myself, what do I want? Why would I possibly put myself through this? What do I want? And I want a healthy planet, a caring society, a nation I can be proud of, and finally an innovative and thriving economy that is moving to a low-carbon future. So for social inequality, that's part of that caring society. I look at it, and I remember reading books by Thomas Axworthy, Pierre Trudeau, about what is the just society. And it starts with income inequality. That's the biggest challenge, and people like Chrystia Freeland have written about this in Plutocrats, Joseph Stiglitz. Income inequality is the first thing, so you need a vision to deal with that, and it starts with taxing the people at the higher levels so they can help the people at the lower levels. And I think the party that I've chosen to run with are starting to do with that. It's started, we've got a lot more work to do, but it's started. And you've got to deal with the root causes. And the root causes of some of this, it starts with poverty at the very bottom level. So over the last 4 years, there's been a strategy to specifically address poverty. Well, the minister responsible for it is a professor of poverty. That's what he did, Monsieur Duclos. And it's really over the last few years, because of specific policies, 900,000 Canadians have been moved up the scale out of poverty. There's a Canada Child Benefit that in this riding alone is $5 million a month, and it helps 10,000 families in this riding alone, and 18,000 kids. The average payment's about $502, and it's not a complex thing that you have to wait till tax time to figure it out. It's a simple check that arrives, it's tax-free, and arrives each month. It's making a difference for that lower level of people that are trying to move up into the middle class. And there's other things they've done as well, but part of inequality is that social inequality. First Nations. The biggest difference that I've experienced when I grew up here and came back is the respect for First Nations and the pride of First Nations. And it's starting, we're getting there, but it's about building that relationship and moving forward together. Stephen Point, who I worked for, said, we're all in one canoe. We have to paddle together. We have to rise up on our history, those 7 generations of problems. We aren't going to fix it in 4 years. We aren't going to fix it in 8 years. We need to continually work together as a nation and change the way we deal with each other. That's part of that respectful society that we can be proud of. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. Tyson.
Over the last 30 years, labor productivity has risen over 40%, while real wages and purchasing power have fallen. What none of my colleagues like to admit is that the source of political power doesn't have anything to do with democracy. Real political power in capitalist countries like Canada lies with those who have the economic power. And until we expand democracy to the economy, then our democracy will be totally hollow. It doesn't take a conspiracy theorist to realize that elections are bought and sold in this country. The campaign expense limit in the vast majority of ridings is over $100,000 per candidate, and that's not including third parties and pre-election expenses. But it's women, however, that have been given the worst deal, and that's what I want to focus on today. The Canadian Women's Foundation has noted that the most comprehensive way to measure the wage gap is to compare the annual earnings for both full-time and part-time workers. By this measurement, women earn an average of 69 cents for every dollar earned by men. Internationally, Canada is doing terribly at closing the wage gap. A recent report from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development shows that out of 35 OECD countries, Canada ranks 30th. That's 6th last. Using data from Stats Canada and the overall annual earnings gap of 31%, we can calculate that women are robbed of $148 billion in lost wages every single year. Of this amount, roughly $112 billion is from the private sector, where 76% of workers are employed. This suggests that the gender wage gap provides over $100 billion in annual corporate profit, a clear indication of how deeply the gender wage gap is rooted in and reinforces the gender division of labor within capitalism. All of this reflects simply a simplified gender binary approach, however, which illustrates the general trends but misses the experience of specific groups. Indigenous women working full-time are paid only 65 cents to the dollar, while other racialized women approximately 67 cents. Women with disabilities working full and part-time, the wage gap is an enormous and shameful 54%. Trans women and gender non-conforming people are similarly faced with massive wage gaps and discrimination. Now consider that while Canada's military budget, used to enforce US NATO economic and political interests across the globe, is approaching $32 billion per year, the total budget for the Human Rights Commission, of which pay equity enforcement is just a component, is only $28 million. Or compare the amount of public resources that are committed to enforcing individual taxation with the meager effort that's dedicated to stopping $148 billion in annual wage theft from working women. There is no comparison. Wage equity is simply not a priority for the government. Why? Because inequality pays. My party would legislate and enforce pay and employment equity and affirmative action programs for women, Indigenous people, people with disabilities, racialized and 2S LGBTIQ people, and we would challenge inequality at every level. Thank you.
Thank you, Tyson. Jeremy.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you to all of you for showing up. The People's Party of Canada has 4 core values: personal responsibility, individual freedom, fairness, and respect. We want all Canadians to be treated equally, and our policies are designed to benefit all Canadians, regardless of gender, ethnicity, age, or religion. Because of the Indian Act, our First Nations are currently not being treated equally. We will replace the Indian Act with a new legal framework that guarantees equal rights and responsibilities to Aboriginal people as Canadians and supports the self-reliance of communities. We will promote individual property rights on reserves and engage with Aboriginal communities to ensure federal programs are better targeted to benefit communities most in need. Our veterans have also been left behind, with their pensions replaced by inadequate lump sum payments, leaving them in dire financial straits. The PPC will recognize and respect the unique sacrifices of those who have served Canada, those who have served Canada's armed forces. We will reinstate the fair disability pension, instigate a line-by-line review of the new Veterans Charter to simplify the system, and we will legislate our country's obligation to our veterans in a military covenant. Canada's healthcare system has the worst wait times of any developed country, and we are among the OECD countries that spend the most on healthcare. It was $20 billion in 2006. This year, it's $40 billion. The problem is we are the only developed country where the government has a monopoly on healthcare. The USA does not have the solution. Europe does. Mixed public-private systems and universal systems that provide all citizens equal access. Wait times are very short, and nobody is denied care because of low income. We need to follow these examples to better serve Canadians. Healthcare is a provincial jurisdiction, and the People's Party will stop meddling in it. Currently, the federal government insists that provinces satisfy a series of conditions set in the Canada Health Act in exchange for transfer payments. This discourages innovation, and the money doesn't specifically fund healthcare. It ends up in general revenue. The PPC will replace the Canada Health Transfer cash payments with a permanent tax transfer of tax points. equivalent tax, a transfer of tax points equivalent, I'll try it one more time. Basically, we're going to give the provinces the GST, which also equals $40 billion this year, and we're going to create the conditions for them to innovate and adopt the proven successful methods of other countries. We don't want band-aid solutions, though. Simply throwing buckets of money at problems while ignoring our rising national debt is a recipe for disaster. So a People's Party of Canada government's first priority will be to balance the budget in 2 years, just as the Chrétien government was able to do in 1997. We will accomplish this by eliminating corporate welfare and ending foreign development aid. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeremy. Philip.
Madam Chairperson, if you please, a point of order. I am an expert on communication, and that means I should be able to see the audience that I'm communicating to know if I'm communicating. Is it possible that we have some light over there? I mean, these are good people, and some of them are quite good looking.
We're in a theater, so this is the lighting that we have. Thank you, though.
Will you boo if you please? If you don't like it, because I can't see you. All right. Well, this is an interesting situation, and I just want to point out, when a forum does not include access to all registered parties or all candidates in an electoral district, there must be reasonable basis for the exclusion of any party or candidate. That's why I made a fuss. I'm a Democrat. I am supposed to be here. And as to being able to contact, well, dang it all, I'm a ratepayer here. You got me in the Sooke
Dr.
registry,
Ney,
anyhow.
we have the guidelines. We'd really like to hear your answer to the question.
Well, okay. Now, if you want equality, you've got to treat people equally, right? Which means you have the same law for everybody. And so, believe it or not, I think all these separate groups add to the inequality. If you had one law for everybody, then you'd have the basis for equality. Now, I don't know where you were this morning at 6 o'clock. I was getting up and went down to the clinic, and there I spent a hard day, and the patients were mad at me because I was late. Why? Because of Mackenzie. You know, that rascal who makes it so hard to get by. An hour and a half to get to work. But what people want is equal dignity. And if I was seeing a family, like I usually do, and I said, why are you treating one child differently from another? Because if you do that, the one that's getting advantages, that's nice. But what do all the other kids in the family say? This isn't right. And that person who's getting the advantages thinks, I don't like this, getting all the advantages. I want to be treated as everybody else. Now, one of the problems here is that we are a spoiled country. We have the advantages over all the countries I've ever spoken in, and I've spoken lots of places, including the House of Lords in London. And there you've got to know your P's and Q's, your Majesty, your etc. So I know a little bit about people, and I know this is not fair. Medicine is falling apart. Doctors don't trust patients, patients don't trust doctors. And there are tangible reasons for that. And they can be fixed, but not with money. Money won't do it, and producing more doctors won't do it.
Thank you, Dr. Ney. David.
I'd like to start by saying thank you to the organizers. Thank you, Maja Tait, for hosting this, and to the Chamber of Commerce for all the work it takes to pull this together. Thank you. We have 4 major policy planks in our platform to address the inequality issues in Canada. First of all, free tuition for trade school, college, and university. We say that education is the basis for increasing people's ability to get into the new economy, to deal with the changes we see, the ups and downs in our economy, and especially in the future, as we move off fossil fuels and move on to renewable energy, there's going to be a lot of transition. We've heard it with the fisher people who are fishing have had to transition, our forestry workers have had to transition, and soon fossil fuel workers will have to transition as well. And so we're really campaigning on investing in human capital by free tuition for trade school, college, and university. That's one of our top priorities. Secondly, we've always campaigned as a Green Party on the guaranteed livable income. I've been knocking on doors since December, and I hear from people who are not well off in our riding, a woman in Esquimalt Road saying there's so much red tape. She has a daughter who suffers from mental health issue, and she says the amount of paperwork I have to go through, and it's not just once a year, it's once a month. It's so hard to get the benefits that my daughter has earned or deserves because of her disability. So we're saying let's simplify the programs, bring in a guaranteed livable income for all Canadians, because it's not rocket science. The way to deal with poverty is to help people up with a helping hand financially. That's what the guaranteed livable income stands for. It's expensive. I'm going to explain in a minute how we're going to pay for it. We're also campaigning on basic dental care. Dental care is a key issue for people who are not well off. It has huge impact on health, so we're campaigning on universal basic dental care, and also, last but not least, universal pharmacare. I met a man in the Gorge Tillicum part of our riding who said, at the end of the month, I have to choose between buying my prescription drugs and buying my groceries. This shouldn't happen in Canada, and we're going to bring in a national pharmacare program. How do we pay for that? Well, this goes to the equality question as well, because we say there's a real sense in Canada that the wealthiest 1% are not paying their fair share. They can hire accountants and lawyers and really reduce their tax burdens in a way that just isn't fair. So we're saying, let's revise our tax code with the Fair Tax Commission. Let's bring in a 1% tax. Let's bring in a 1% tax on people who have net wealth, of over $20 million. Also, let's increase the tax on the banks. Let's say the commercial banks, so 1% tax across the board, they're making massive profits, and we're saying we need to increase taxes on the banks. Lastly, France has brought in a new tax on internet companies. Amazon, Facebook, we should follow the French example. Those companies are getting away. They're mainly American-based, and they're not paying taxes in Canada. Let's tax the internet companies.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Randall.
Well, good evening, everyone. I've had the privilege of serving as your MP for the last 8 years, and one thing I've learned about Sooke is you can expect a good crowd at these meetings, even if you can't see the crowd. So I'm going to go straight. It's a little odd not to get to do an introduction, but I'm going to go straight to the equity question. I think most of you, like me, think of Canada as a place where if you work hard and do what you're supposed to do, you can get ahead in life. And what's happening now is we're becoming more and more unequal. And with the rising cost of living, it's being more and more difficult for working people to make ends meet at the end of the month, and more difficult for seniors to retire with dignity. So the whole focus of our NDP campaign this time is on those issues of equity and affordability. And I'll just talk about a couple of those things now. The first and most important is housing. And I know that Sooke has been working at the community level on getting affordable housing and getting shelter space, and has done a very good job, because the other thing I've learned about Sooke is there are more volunteers per capita here than any place in the entire country. So what we're saying is, under the existing national housing strategy, not a single unit of affordable housing has been built in this riding in the last 4 years. So we're promising to get busy building 500,000 units across the country. That'll end up with something like 3,000 or 4,000 units being built in the Greater Victoria area of co-op housing, which we stopped building 30 years ago, or of other nonprofit supportive housing types, especially for seniors. And when you get people housing, then they can deal with all the other crises in their lives. If they have mental health problems, if they have health problems, you can't deal with those if you're not housed. And we have a very large number, unfortunately, of veterans in this riding who are homeless. And the only housing that's been provided was by the Legion, who did their own project and paid for it themselves. So it's time for the federal government to get behind those community efforts and make sure that everybody has secure, affordable housing in the community. Now, what else are we going to do on these? Pharmacare and dental care, I'll talk a bit under the health question. But one of the things we've said is we should restore a federal minimum wage. Now, that only applies to about 10% of the workers, but setting a federal minimum wage right now at $15 an hour would give 77,000 people an increase. Who are those people? They're the people who work in the banks, the radio stations, for newspapers, or at the airport doing your security. And so If we move at $15 an hour now and then for over 4 years to $20 an hour, those people would be able to earn a living wage, and it would set a good example. I know the provincial government's also moving, so that when you work hard, you can keep a roof over your head and you can feed your kids. Thanks.
Thank you, candidates. We'll now move on to our second question, which is on affordability and taxes. These are a major concern of all Canadians. How will you assist those who are struggling to meet their basic needs for food, shelter, clothing, and address the rising cost of providing social services and be fiscally responsible? Tyson will start with this question.
4 words. Make the rich pay. The Communist Party has by far the most serious and the only poverty reduction strategy which is remotely adequate, and it's one that taxes the greedy, not the needy. We'll double the corporate tax rate, restore the capital tax, and impose taxes on 100% of capital gains, while eliminating taxes on incomes under $40,000. What's more, we'll end tax loopholes and shelters, collect unpaid and deferred corporate taxes, and we will jail corporate tax evaders. The regressive HST and provincial sales taxes should be abolished, and wealth and inheritance taxes imposed on estates over $1 million. I'm proud to be representing the only party that believes housing shouldn't be a commodity but a human right, and we would make that the law. My party would build 1 million units of affordable social housing, which would additionally create hundreds of thousands of new green jobs in construction and manufacturing. Using rent controls and rollbacks, we'd ensure that no one pays more than 20% of their income on shelter. We'd use federal powers to end the housing crisis and homelessness now, building emergency shelters and transition housing, as well as banning evictions, mortgage foreclosures, and utility cutoffs due to unemployment. While certain parties have claimed to be the only ones fighting for free education, the fact is I was fighting for it when I ran in 2015, and the Communist Party has been fighting it for 100 years. Unlike my colleagues, I've also actually been involved in the student movement, organizing strikes and rallies, demanding free education and democratic education, which my party would treat as a right for domestic and international students alike, wiping student debts, providing stipends to live, and ending unpaid internships. As for healthcare, we would include pharma, dental, optic, mental health services, as well as long-term care under Medicare completely free of charge. We'll enforce the Canada Health Act and close private for-profit clinics and labs, reversing P3 agreements and adequately funding public hospitals and healthcare services. My party would enshrine in the Constitution a labor bill of rights guaranteeing workers the right to strike, picket, organize, and to free collective bargaining, and to take collective political action. We would raise the minimum wage to $20 an hour and increase employment by legislating a 32-hour work week with no loss in take-home pay, as well as 4 weeks paid vacation. Additionally, we'll implement a guaranteed annual livable income and substantially increase pensions and disability rates. Indigenous peoples are vastly overrepresented in terms of poverty, which is why my party would recognize and implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, as well as the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, taking emergency action to improve living conditions and ending the racist and discriminatory cap on educational and health funding for Treaty First Nations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tyson. Jeremy.
Just going to grab this right away. I think I'm the tallest one here. The People's Party of Canada will immediately lower the cost of living by eliminating the carbon tax, which is a cash grab BC has shown doesn't lower carbon emissions. It only makes heating, transportation, and food more expensive. We will lower grocery bills by eliminating dairy supply management, a system that has reduced the number of Canadian dairy farmers from over 100,000 to 14,000. All while costing the poorest 20% of Canadians an extra $359 per year. It's basically a 2.3% extra tax on the poor. Canadian beef, pork, and grain farmers survive without supply management. Dairy farmers can too. We will also make cell phones and internet cheaper by removing the CRTC from the telecom industry and allowing real competition, which will benefit consumers. After we've balanced the budget in 2 years, we will lower and simplify personal income tax. Canadians waste $7 billion per year just to comply with Canada's overly complicated tax laws. Under a PPC government, people making under $15,000 a year will pay zero tax. People making from $15,000 to $100,000 will pay 15%. People making over $100,000 will pay 25%. We will immediately address the housing shortage by lowering immigration levels to 150,000 people per year. That will result in 200,000 less people competing for a place to live. 41% of new immigrants head for either Toronto or Vancouver, so this will have a very strong impact immediately here on the coast. We're also going to eliminate capital gains tax, which will encourage more investment in new housing units and encourage existing homeowners to sell properties. We will establish free trade between provinces by removing interprovincial trade barriers, making it easier for Canadians to buy, sell, and work freely within their own country. Now, here's an uncomfortable fact that no one mentions. It's never going to be inexpensive to buy a home here on the coast. This is the most desirable place in Canada, if not the world, to live. Pardon me. And that only drives the prices up. There are plenty of other beautiful places in Canada that are still affordable, but for workers like nurses, accountants, and engineers, these places are inaccessible because their skills are not recognized in other provinces. Freeing internal trade will open many new opportunities for Canadians and further unite us as a country. And finally, a People's Party government will reform the provincial equalization payments to make them more fair and efficient. This year, Quebec will get $13 billion, while Alberta, whose economy has been devastated, will get nothing. We'll provide poorer provinces with the right incentives to develop pro-growth economic policies to reduce their dependence on federal money and escape the equalization poverty trap. This will benefit all Canadians. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeremy. Philip.
I have the advantage, and truly it is the advantage of not having these questions ahead of time, so I can speak as I feel. I've spent over 65 years, one side or the other, of a university lectern. And one thing you learn is that he who asks the questions rules the world. Isn't that true? And some of the assumptions built behind what I'm supposed to address are so important. You notice that it's a struggle. Do you know what they found in zoos? That lions fell apart, they got old and hairy, and the gazelle, they weren't in very good shape until they put them side by side. Isn't that interesting? Creatures, human creatures included, need to struggle. And I know this because I've run a geriatric unit. If you make things too easy, they die. People need to struggle. Now that they should struggle from an equal basis, well, we've got a pretty good constitution. The problem is so many do-gooders are out there pandering to inadequacy, in helplessness, etc. You are inadvertently reinforcing helplessness. And that's dumb. You want to reinforce struggle. And what do you guys, did you struggle? I grew up milking cows in the morning. Was it a struggle? That was before breakfast. And what did you have? What did I have for breakfast? Would you believe? Cow mash sometimes. And on one occasion, there was a little black thing in the cow mash, as you would expect, and I thought, this is different. I was chewing on rat shit. So I can tell you in the peanut butter what is rat shit and what's not. It has a peculiar taste. In any case, I have cleaned toilets and done just about everything. I've also been a businessman. I've also lived in Hong Kong where there was a flat tax. And if you've got to have a tax, have 3 layers of flat tax. But then you have all these people who work in tax departments. What are you going to do with these people? Well, you give them incentives to start their own business. But behind this question is the idea that people shouldn't struggle. I question that. And the research questions that. And people live healthier, longer lives by struggling. It has to be a reasonable struggle. So if I did, and maybe I will, run a program for old people, do you know what? There won't be any elevators. There will be ramps, and old people will help each other get up these ramps and push, maybe spend all day. And do you know, I bet you dollars to donuts, I give you 10 to 1 odds, those people will live longer. And so, talking for...
Thank you very much. David.
You heard from the introduction that I've worked in government for 28 years, and government can sometimes really make a huge difference in people's lives, but sometimes we also see massive waste of taxpayer money. And one of the ways that the Green Party of Canada is going to balance and take fiscal responsibility for its very ambitious social justice program is taking a very hard look at how our government spends money. The day I left the Liberal Party, some of you might remember me from 2015 when I was here as a Liberal, the day I left was when the Liberals bought the Kinder Morgan pipeline for $4.5 billion. In my view, a terrible waste of money. But worse than that, we have another planned $10 to $13 billion expenditure on our government books for twinning the Kinder Morgan pipeline. And the Green Party stands against that. We say we should not spend that money on pipelines, we should spend it on humans. And that goes to some of the social policy agenda that I mentioned earlier today. The other thing is we're planning to spend billions of dollars on the F-35 fighter jet. We've already spent millions and millions on it, and we're saying that's just an expensive program, and it's the wrong kind of jet for Canada. So we're asking that whole plan to buy the F-35 fighter jet, which is really designed as a stealth fighter bomber, not useful for the future, in my view, of Canada's Air Force, that program be cut. We will need fighter jets, but not the F-35. We're also saying that our healthcare system needs to be looked at. We're prepared for a major investment in healthcare. As I mentioned earlier, we're campaigning on universal pharmacare and basic dental. But there's a better way for us to be delivering our medical services. We need to be using the talents of our nurses and nurse practitioners. We need doctors to be working in teams with psychologists and psychotherapists. We need to create a different kind of system where we're expecting doctors to administer offices, manage their staff, and take on a huge leadership role in their groups when, in fact, many of them just want to be doctors. Let's free up doctor time to focus on doctor work. And our target is to have every Canadian who wants a family doctor have access to a family doctor, but we're saying we need to innovate in how that service is delivered in order to get there, and that's where the government should be, the federal government should be spending its money, is on innovation in the system. I worked in the justice system on justice transformation projects for 10 years, the last 10 years. And we managed to cut massive costs, especially out of the provincial court, where provincial court judges are being paid $340,000 a year to resolve small claims cases. And it's the same thing in our medical system. We need to focus our judges and our doctors and our high-cost service providers on high-value work and bring in others like mediators and dispute resolution experts in the justice system to address the problems they can resolve. So we need to look at how government operates in a fundamental way, and we will balance the books in 5 years. Surprisingly, we have the same target as the Conservative Party, 5 years from now until a balanced budget, by cutting costs on one side and raising taxes, as I mentioned earlier in my earlier answer. So thank you. We can do it in 5 years. We can have a massive social justice program.
Thank you very much, David.
And a reasonable tax program.
Randall.
So the question is entitled Affordability and Taxes, but I'm going to go to the second part. How do we meet people's basic needs? Make sure that they can meet their basic needs. So the group in this country which has the greatest trouble meeting basic needs are First Nations and other Indigenous people. And so there's some things we could do right now. The government could stop fighting Indigenous kids in court for fair funding and equal funding for those who are in care. They could spend the money, choose to spend the money to eliminate boiled water advisories so that all First Nations have safe drinking water. And we could get busy trying to help restore First Nations food sovereignty. Right now, rural and remote First Nations, especially in the north, cannot afford healthy, nutritious food and have mostly lost the ability to produce food locally. When it comes to meeting other basic needs, I'm going to use this to talk about healthcare. We had a vision of healthcare in this country that came from Tommy Douglas, but we stopped partway through that vision. And it's hard for me to understand how we think of healthcare and we don't think that oral health is part of that. And we don't think that prescription drugs are part of health. And so that's why we're promising that we will move very quickly to make those two things part of our public healthcare system. Right now, we know that 10% of people do not fill their prescriptions from their doctor, and they don't tell their doctor because of the shame of not being able to afford it. And we know that even more people cut their dosages. They self-decide they can take less medicine, trying to stretch things, because if they don't, they have trouble paying the rent and buying nutritious food. So there's no excuse for a rich country like ours with a public health care system leaving out pharmacare and dentacare. Now, how are we going to pay for all the wonderful things we're promising? I know we're not supposed to refer to other candidates or parties, but imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. So the NDP has started talking a long time ago about making the super rich, those who earn more than $20 million, pay their fair share by having a 1% tax every year. And we had the parliamentary budget officer, that's an independent officer of parliament, look at our proposal. He said it was very feasible, and he said it would produce about $6 billion a year. So that's where we would start in trying to raise the money to pay for these kind of things. But the other part of that is there's some startup costs. But in the end, we'll actually save money through pharmacare and dentacare. Why will we do that? Because people who don't get their prescriptions filled end up sicker, they end up in hospital. And I met a nurse who told me about lots of people she sees staying in hospital where they can get their prescription medicines and trying to delay going home, occupying those beds longer than they need to, because when they get out, they have to pay themselves. And we know that good oral health leads to good health overall. So if we focus on adding these to our health system and on preventative health measures, we can actually save money by working together, because there are some things we can do better by working
Thank you,
collectively,
Randall.
and some that we can't.
Jamie.
Well, in keeping with the evening being a positive evening and non-critical, I would like to start by thanking Donald Trump. Donald Trump, who ran for office proudly saying that he never paid taxes because he's so smart. Well, that's what got me into this. That's the first thing, was that worry of people like Donald Trump and that fear that, you know, all it takes for evil to succeed in the world is for good men and women to do nothing. The second thing, though, is affordability. It's my children. I've got 3 kids from 19 to 30 now, and making ends meet, even in a well-off family, is hard. And so that got me into thinking about this, about running. And when I looked at the parties, I looked at what the Liberals have done the last 4 years, and they have set the conditions for success. We are not there yet, but they have turned the country in a different direction, and they've started by doing things like the poverty, working on poverty like I talked about before, squishing the income inequality like I talked about before, housing. The federal government, and it's the Liberals, the federal government got out of housing about 20 years ago or so, 30 years ago. And that was at the time when people thought, oh, well, this is provincial responsibility and this is federal, and the two shouldn't meet. I think we've grown past that. People realize now it's all levels of government. It's mayors, it's Federation of Canadian Municipalities, it's First Nations, it's provincial governments, it's federal governments. They have to work together. So the federal government's back in the housing game. Is it enough? No. I went to a housing town hall that Randall organized some time ago with Mitzi Dean, and we aren't there yet. The federal government, the money is not flowing yet. However, they've made agreements with BC Housing for $990 million. The federal government doesn't get credit for it. It goes straight into BC Housing on their priorities, because they're the people that are closer to the front line and know what needs to be done. But we have started moving. I talked to Macola Housing. I've talked to Greater Victoria Housing Society. We're not there yet, but we turned in the right direction, and we've started doing the subsidies. We've started doing the units, and we've quadrupled the number of units being built. And yes, Randall's absolutely right. There's no new units in this riding, but there's 3,700 units in Greater Victoria that have been funded in part by the federal government. That is a huge change from 4 years ago. When you look at that, the next thing, healthcare. So the Liberal government is bringing in a pharmacare. They've been working on it for 2 years. They've got the details figured out. They will have pharmacare in place within 2 years, and that's realistic when you've got to do the legislation. And then the next thing that we need to tackle is affordability for people who are in that next bracket, the people who can't afford a home, but they've got 2 incomes. They're actually doing quite well. That's got to be worked on. There's some changes in first homeowner buyers, particularly for Greater Victoria, that brings the threshold to $800,000. That's a positive thing. The next thing we've got to work on, and what I'm going to work on, is transportation infrastructure. We need someone inside government.
Thank you, Jamie. Okay, so this brings us to round 3. And our third question is on climate change. And that is, what are your specific plans for environmental stewardship? And leading off on this set will be Jeremy.
There's no climate emergency. The policy debate about global warming is not grounded in science anymore. It's been hijacked by proponents of big government who are using crude propaganda techniques to impose their views. I know this is supposed to be non-controversial or non-confrontational, but if you want to boo and hiss, it's okay. I'm getting used to it. I'm going to get to them. They publicly ridicule and harass anyone who expresses doubt. They make exaggerated claims to scare people. They even manipulate school children, getting them to pressure their parents and demonstrate in the streets. The People's Party of Canada rejects climate alarmism. It's an undisputed fact that the world's climate has always changed and will continue to change. The IPCC climate scientists of the UN insist man-made CO2 is the main cause of climate change, but geologists, engineers, and meteorologists disagree. Climate change alarmism is based on flawed models that have consistently failed at correctly predicting the future. None of the cataclysmic predictions that have been made about climate since the 1970s have come true. There's no new ice age, no steady warming in direct relation to increases in CO2 levels, no disappearance of polar ice caps, no exceptional rise in ocean levels, no abnormal increase in catastrophic weather events, no widespread crop failures or famine. The polar bears aren't going extinct, their population is thriving. You can Google that.
Let's let the candidate continue.
NASA's latest data shows Greenland's largest glacier has been growing for the last 3 years. Sure, it was shrinking for decades, now it's growing again. The climate changes. A People's Party government will withdraw from the Paris Accord and abandon unrealistic greenhouse gas reduction targets. We will stop sending billions to developing countries to help them reduce their emissions. We will abolish the carbon tax and leave it to provincial governments to adopt programs to reduce emissions if they want to.
Let's let the candidate finish, please.
Thank you, Maya. We will abolish subsidies for green technology and let private players like Tesla develop profitable and alternatives. We will invest in mitigation strategies if problems arise as any result of natural climate change, and we will prioritize implementing practical solutions to make Canada's air, water, and soil cleaner, including bringing clean drinking water to First Nations communities. And as your local MP, I will do whatever it takes to get some of that federal clean water money to rehabilitate our salmon habitat here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeremy. And Philip, you're up next.
All right, climate change. Was this yesterday or tomorrow you're talking about? Climate changes all the time. And you notice that it's become a religion without a deity, but everybody believes it's there. And you know it is BS, meaning it's bad science, because nobody equally considers alternatives. I taught research methodology at postgraduate levels in university. And the last thing you do is adhere to one hypothesis. You've got to look at all the other possibilities. And the possibility that really intrigues me is rapid orbital decay, which means that our eventual crashing into the sun may be happening faster for various reasons. And the last thing you want is wind turbines, because they reduce the rate of rotations, which reduce the rate of revolutions, which means that our orbit decays faster and it's going to get hotter, obviously. But the problem is this whole thing has become a religion. Everybody believes, right? Don't you believe that? Climate change, of course, climate change, it always did. My wife is in the audience here. She is a famous, and I mean this, pediatrician. So we have often, famous. She's famous, I'm infamous. And she and I discuss these things, and there are all sorts of possibilities. Did you see that there are no more sunspots? Oh my gosh, what's that mean? And how do the center of the magnetic pole, how do they keep wandering all over the place? I'm a navigator. You can't navigate if this pole is moving all over the place. Oh, it's CO2, obviously. CO2 has a great impact on magnetic pole. Come on, you guys, you're smart. You know, Sooke has some of the smartest people in Canada. They migrate this way. Go west, young person. Well, you can't go further west. You'll fall off the edge of the ocean or somewhere, right? People here are smart. But I'm surprised that they buy this without a lot of debate and question. And what is actually happened? I don't know, was it in Colorado, the temperature came down in one day, 35 degrees? I don't know, where's Marie? 50 degrees, something like that. Incredible. Nobody's ever heard of such a thing. And you see there was frost on the ground here yesterday in Sooke? That's not allowed. Think, question, and let's do proper science, right? Thank you.
Thank you, Philip. David.
Thank you. The Green Party of Canada believes the science. The scientists are very clear. We have 10 years. We're facing 10 years before we may face irreversible climate change. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has said we need to act now. The Green Party of Canada is the only party with a 20-point plan that lays out exactly how we can get to zero net emissions by 2050. We have a target of the most ambitious target of all the other parties, 60% reduction by 2030, and we've laid out how we're going to get there. The key part of it is getting off fossil fuels. We need to move off fossil fuels and onto renewables as quickly as we can. That means solar, geothermal, that means wind, that means tidal where we can. And Sooke is a great example of where that's already happened. You all know the story of the Sauk First Nation, where they've gone off diesel entirely. No more diesel generators, they're on solar. Not only that, but the people who built their solar are now being called on by First Nations and others across this country to go and build their solar facilities. That is the perfect example right here in Sooke of how we can make the transition off diesel and fossil fuels generally, and onto renewables, specifically solar. Let's do this across the country. It's a massive job creation project, and we have to do more, though. We also have to look at our existing infrastructure, schools, municipal, federal, and provincial buildings. Look at the buildings we have now, and let's retrofit and upgrade them right now. We see roughly 400,000 jobs merely out of the retrofitting of existing buildings. We can drastically change the course of our country's energy footprint if we take action now. It's going to take collaboration. It's going to take listening to the science. And one of our proposals is to say, let's form an inter-cabinet of all the parties to work on this in a collaborative manner so we focus on deep transformational change now, not the incrementalism, not the denialism that you'll hear from others. We need action now, and the Green Party is the only party seriously ready to deliver on it. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Okay, Randall.
I guess what I'll start by saying is I'm one of the members of Parliament with the longest and strongest green record. So when you talk about stewardship, I've worked my entire life to try and make sure that we have a clean, healthy environment and to fight climate change. On the first Earth Day, I went with my friends. We were students, and we blocked traffic, and we pissed a lot of people off, and we didn't educate them at all about what we were doing. So I have learned over the years that it takes a bit more than that. 30 years ago, I worked for an Indigenous-led organization. I did my first tour of the province in high schools, talking about the dangers of global warming and plastic pollution. So I've been fighting this fight all my life. In the House of Commons, I introduced a motion for a comprehensive recovery plan for the southern resident killer whales, because they're iconic, because they're part of our tourism industry, but also because they're a key predator in our natural systems. And if we lose them, it's a sign that we're going to lose the whole system. And so it's a danger to ourselves not to take this seriously. We still don't have a comprehensive plan. And my criticism of the current plan is that it's targeted local fishermen, which are not the main problem at all. What we need is to get Chinook in the water. And we do that by supporting the hatchery. I sat down with the Minister of Fisheries and begged him for money for the Sooke hatchery, and he didn't give it. When it comes to protecting southern resident killer whales, I sat down with the Minister of Transport and said, could we move the shipping lanes away from the Swiftsure Bank? It's no good banning local fishermen from the Swiftsure Bank if you send 11,000 tankers and freighters over the Swiftsure Bank with all the noise and pollution. Now, when it comes to the big job, and that's making the transition to a non-carbon economy, I want to make it very clear that I think that the goals of the Green Party, I agree with, but we can't get there if we leave people behind. So the center of the NDP's program is a transition program that puts working families at the center. So if we stop subsidizing the fossil fuel industries and we put that money into renewables, we can create 300,000 new jobs all around the country in every community. So the jobs go from being just in the oil fields in the north into every community. And I fly back and forth to Ottawa all the time. I meet lots of people on the plane who have their families living here and they work in the oil fields. And they're a bit suspicious. They don't really believe we can do that. So I was one of the members of Parliament who commissioned a study on what skills are used in the oil industry and what skills are used in renewable energy. And guess what? They're pretty similar. So the basis of our program is retraining, it won't take a lot of retraining, and relocation grants if necessary, so that we leave nobody out of this struggle, because we won't get to the goals we need to meet if we leave people behind.
Thank you, Randall. Jamie.
Thank you very much. This is the #1 issue in this election. This is the most important issue. And it's not a negative issue, it's a positive issue. We can do this. We dealt with ozone, we dealt with acid rain, we cleaned up our rivers, we can swim in the gorge, we can do this. We need bold action, but it has to be irreversible, sustainable action. We can't go the way the United States has gone, where somebody comes into power and changes it and moves us backwards. We need to move forward. To do that, we need to bring everyone along. Not just the people who are convinced, not just the few percent of people that vote for a certain party. We all need to move forward, and we need to bring the rest of the country along. I want to be inside a government, and I want to be able to be a strong voice in that government. And one of the benefits of that is the access. So I had an hour and a half with the Prime Minister downtown in Canoe Club in July, and I said, what about the pipeline? What about this pipeline? Why are we doing this? And he said what he said publicly. He said, we need to bring everyone else along. We need to bring along the people that don't agree with us. That pipeline allowed and forced a negotiation with provinces that we now have a price on carbon across this country. We are one of the only countries in the world. Washington State can't even do that. We are getting the whole country. Alberta right now gets about 49% of their electricity from coal. Thermal coal is burnt in Alberta to produce electricity. By 2030, we will be off that coal, and the province of Alberta is committed to it. Whether Jason Kenney likes it or not, he's committed to it. We put limitations in the tar sands. We've got $23 billion in innovation that is looking at new clean technologies. I did that as part of the venture capital funding for the province of BC, and the federal government is moving quickly in that direction. And what we've done in the last 4 years is set the conditions for success. We went from 1% of our oceans protected to 13.8 to be technical, percent of our oceans protected under law. Read the Sea Blue report, seablue.org. That's David Suzuki Foundation, Parks and Wilderness Society, WWF, a whole bunch else. It is a laudatory report that says we are moving in the right direction. We will have 25% of our oceans protected by 2025 and 30% by 2030. But you need a government that can really do these things, not just talk about them, and we need to bring the rest of the country along on these things. 8 out of 9 oil and gas subsidies are already on the chopping block. Some of them, though, are linked to diesel for First Nations communities that have not yet moved to that solar technology that actually doesn't work so well in the far north. We've got to find solutions, but we've got to bring everybody along on this journey, and we've got to have an economy that drives it. And that's what we're doing. And we're working well on that. I want real climate action, and I want it now. I can't wait for 30 years.
Thank you,
I need
Jamie.
it now.
And Tyson.
My party is the only party that recognizes environmental destruction not as coincidental, but as inherent to and inseparable from capitalism and our system of for-profit energy and commodity production. Dr. Michael Parenti wrote that the essence of capitalism is to turn nature into commodities and commodities into capital. The live green earth is transformed into dead gold bricks, with luxury items for the few and toxic slag heaps for the many. The glittering mansion overlooks a vast sprawl of shantytowns, wherein a desperate, demoralized humanity is kept in line with drugs, television, and armed force. We can't afford to fall for the empty promises of green capitalism, frankly, which is why I'm here today to present an eco-socialist alternative that recognizes the crisis for what it is, a crisis which is rooted in our socioeconomic system, which rewards destructive, exploitative, violent, racist, sexist, and corrupt corporate and government practices. What my colleagues fail to understand is that these are not simply bad policy decisions, but fundamental characteristics of capitalism which cannot be fixed. Non-solutions, like the carbon tax, simply turn carbon into another commodity, rather than reducing emissions. And this would impose enormous costs onto working class people in fuel costs, not the destructive corporations responsible for over 70% of emissions. What's needed is a far more comprehensive climate plan that puts energy and natural resources under democratic ownership and control. We would replace cap-and-trade carbon tax schemes with strictly legal limits for pollution and hard caps on emissions to reduce emissions to zero by 2050. If they were serious, the big business parties would impose strong penalties for corporations which break the law and engage in destructive practices for profit, such as dragnetting, ocean fish farming, and clear-cutting, including jail time for corporate executives. You can bet I would. I'd also ban the extraction and export of fresh water by criminal corporations like Nestle. One of the largest sources of carbon emissions in Canada is the military, and I'm the only candidate today who's committed to reducing military spending and getting Canada out of NATO as a necessary component of reaching our climate targets. My party would invest heavily to create new jobs through renewable energy and conservation programs. Urban mass transit would be substantially expanded, eliminating bus and transit fares, and legislating stringent vehicle emissions controls. We'd phase out nuclear energy and the tar sands operations, as well as coal plants, and guarantee jobs for energy industry workers in the renewable energy sector and in other sectors of the economy. We would block all pipeline projects based on expansion of tar sands extraction and halt all fracking operations, which is a promise my party could actually keep because we're committed to getting Canada out of corporate free trade pacts that undermine our democracy, like CETA, NAFTA, the TPP, and others. Thank you very much.
Okay, so this brings us to our fourth and final question, which is the willingness to work with the other parties in government. The adversarial conflicts of elections carry over into Parliament. Rather than simply focusing on transparency and accountability, what are you, and if applicable, your party, going to do to work constructively and positively with the other parties to create a better and more unified society in Canada? And leading off on this will be Philip.
Right. Work with the other parties. I'll work. I generally put in a 10 to 12-hour day. I work, always have. But it's the other parties. They don't want to work. They don't want to even address the essential problems. What is the essential problem? The leader of the House and the Prime Minister says there is a word you may not speak in the House of Commons. What? I thought the House of Commons was the center of the freedom of speech. And you are losing your freedom of speech, where it's the last place to lose that. Do you realize that is a significant step to dictatorship? You must not say this word in Parliament. What? So if I was in Parliament, you would hear me shout, appendectomy! Oh no, that's not the word, it's the other A word. Abortion! Oh, what the hell? Look, we are losing population. Our fertility rate is 1.5. It's an exponential decrease. And that means we're headed for poverty because you cannot run a free market economy on a declining population. I've been a businessman. I've been a director of a development company. I understand business, and everybody does this. I debated this in the UN Council Convention in Egypt, in Cairo. Marie and I were there, 1994. I won the debate on the basis of population implosion. Did you know that? Everybody else was saying explosion. 10 years later, The UN stopped screaming explosion, and now they're saying implosion. Maria and I get invited to various countries, and the major question is, how can we stimulate fertility? Come on, you guys. Do you understand what's, and this is the basis of so much anxiety in the world. Things are going down, and it's not the climate. Well, we got a dang lazy prime minister, and he's cut
Dr.
his
Nate, let's
appearance.
answer the question. And that's how you're going to work with other parties.
Don't we have the most beautiful mayor in Canada?
Hey, let's not distract the audience from answering your question.
Would I work with? I will work with as many people as work as much as I do. Is that fair? And I will concentrate on the real problems. All of this other stuff is an illusion. Thank you.
Thank you. David.
This is a personal question for me because I was trained in the law and I did a lot of litigation when I was in Ottawa. We litigated against tobacco companies smuggling through Akwesasne. We litigated against pharmaceutical companies who were trying to avoid paying their taxes. And the litigation practice that I had for 10 or 15 years in Ottawa taught me one thing, which is that nobody really loses with nobody really wins, with litigation. And we need to find other ways to resolve our disputes in the justice system. I became executive director of the Dispute Resolution Office in Victoria, and we never looked back. We used mediation, cooperative approaches to dispute resolution, and really helped to turn around our justice system. We need the same thing in our political system. And you know how it starts? It starts with proportional representation. I mentioned earlier that I was a member of the Liberal Party for 34 years. But within the first year, the Liberals broke their promise in 2015 that...
Okay, we're not to bash the other party.
Well, this is just about me leaving the Liberal Party because of the broken promise on proportional representation. And so I'm just telling you the story. The last time I was on this stage, some of you were here, I remember, was pushing the idea in the referendum, in the BC referendum, that we really needed to change how our democracy works. Because our democracy currently rewards very adversarial behaviors. It rewards politicians who lie and don't tell the truth. Some of you received a card in the mail today or yesterday, which is full of lies and distortions. And that's just how our political system works, unfortunately, under first past the post. What we need is a system of proportional representation, and then we need a different kind of leadership. And Elizabeth May exemplifies that kind of leadership. I don't know if you've been watching the debates, but she really exemplifies that in her day-to-day work. She tries to work with all of the other parties. It's the reason that she's always elected by her peers as most effective parliamentarian of the year, because she figured out how to work with the other parties. She just got some legislation through, a sole MP, through the Senate and the House. The way she did that, she worked with the Conservative senator first on how do we protect killer whales and dolphins and so on from being held in captivity. She put in legislation in collaboration with her senator friend, who's a Conservative, in the Senate. It went all the way through the House. She got some help from the NDP too, Nathan Cullen, and they worked that out to get through the House together. That's an example, and she's done this on Lyme disease and many other issues. She knows how to work with others because she listens and she collaborates. And that's what the Green Party has stood for since it was founded in 1983. We've been working in a collaborative, supportive way. We have fought for the issues that are very close to our heart. Climate action we don't compromise on, and proportional representation we don't compromise on either. We are the only party that is going to hold the government's feet to the fire. If we have enough seats in a minority government situation where we have the balance of power, proportional representation is going to be one of the issues on the agenda that we will negotiate. We're calling for a citizens' assembly. No
Thank you very
referendum.
much, David.
Thank you.
Randall.
So I'm going to stick to the rules, unlike David, and not attack another candidate or the
Easy.
party. We're heading into probably a minority parliament. And so what I'm offering people in this riding is someone with the skills, experience, and commitment to get things done in Parliament. What you see in Parliament is usually question period, and that's the theater of Parliament. It's important for accountability, but the real work gets done at a different level. So I'm going to give you a couple examples of things I've done. Now, David referred to the bill from the Senate, S203, to ban the captivity of whales and dolphins. That bill had no chance. Elizabeth had no chance to get that through the House because she's not a party. She didn't have a slot. And so the MPs from BC, NDP MPs on the island approached Nathan and said, will you give up your space, one of our party spaces, to Elizabeth so that that bill can pass? If we hadn't done that, that bill wouldn't have gone forward. So yes, that's an example of cooperation, but it wouldn't have happened without some of us taking the initiative to make sure that it did happen. When I first got to Parliament, there was a Conservative majority, and there was a big gap in our human rights legislation. It didn't protect transgender and gender variant people. So I started off with a bill to do that, and everyone said, you're wasting your time, it's a Conservative majority. So I identified 22 Conservatives, and I went and sat down with them and talked to them, and I had transgender people visit them in their offices. And I got that bill through a Conservative majority Parliament. Now, it was blocked by the unelected Senate. So I had to do it again, and there was a Liberal majority. I introduced the bill again, and I sat down with Jody Raybould-Wilson and said, listen, it's my bill. If you'll take it over as a government bill, I'll give you all the credit. The important thing is that it gets done. And so that bill finally became law. And so that's two examples. I'm going to run out of time, but I'll try a third. As the NDP defense critic, I've been working very hard to make sure that we have a well-funded, well-equipped, well-trained, and well-supported military. But there's one thing that's wrong in the military right now. We lose one serving member to death by suicide every month. And in the military code of conduct, it's a disciplinary offense to self-harm. So the military still treats self-harm as something you discipline someone for. So I introduced a private member's bill to remove that from the military code of conduct so that serving members can get the mental health assistance they need without that big barrier. And I got the Green Party to support it, the Conservative Party to support it, the Bloc Québécois to support it. Only one party didn't support it, but I'm adhering to the rules here. So it didn't, that party happened to have a majority, so I'm gonna have to go back and introduce that bill again. But I have a fairly good record of getting things done by working with other parties in the House of Commons. And the last part of this, now they've got 30 seconds, is David Aitken keeps track of which opposition MPs get the most projects funded in their riding. And the time I've been in Parliament, I always rank in the top 5 of opposition members for getting money for projects in their riding. I intend to keep on working hard for the people in this riding. Thank you.
Thank you, Randall. Jamie, please.
The Kwakwaka'wakw Nations up northern Vancouver Island, they have a meeting house. I can't remember the full name of the house, but it translates as the place we come together to agree. That's what we need to be doing in our House of Commons and all our levels of government. If I'm elected, the first thing I'm going to do, I said this, I got some laughter earlier today at a different one, but the first thing I would do is invite Randall and his partner out for dinner to ensure that we can, first of all, to thank Randall for his service and the 8 years and all the work he's been doing. Secondly, to learn from him and to make sure none of those constituency files get dropped. And the third thing is to find out how he actually survived doing this for 8 years. And anyway, I just found out we have to go to Ottawa if you win. I didn't know that, but anyway. I had dinner once with a guy named Ray Speaker. He was Reform, and at the worst time in the House of Commons, he would meet with Paul Martin in a shared bathroom because their two offices were side by side, and they shared a bathroom in the House of Commons. That's where they would meet to make things done. We can't go back to that. We can't have a parliament working that way. It's got to be collegial. We have to work together. We've got to look at things like the integrated court downtown that Ernie Quantz established, where the prosecution, the defense, the police, the social workers, the assertive community treatment teams, they all come together and decide, and then go to the judge with a collaborative solution for sentencing of someone who has mental health or drug addiction issues. But that's what we need. We need that positive politics. We need to be moving forward on all of that. I read the Atlantic magazine, American magazine recently, the first line of an article, and honestly, it was about blackface. That's what it was about. But it starts with, the Liberal government of Justin Trudeau is the most successful progressive government in the world. It had a gender-balanced cabinet, transparent mandate letters for ministers, instituted a carbon tax, drove forward with over 50 climate change initiatives, legalized marijuana, brought in medical assistance and dying legislation. Last year, for the first time, Canada settled more refugees than any other country. Because of higher government benefits, child poverty is at its lowest level in history. Unemployment is at its lowest level in 40 years. Economic growth reached 3%. This is what the Liberal government's done. So you can have all the collaboration between parties, but you have to have leadership. And I learned a lot about leadership in the military. I did some tough jobs, and in that I learned that leadership doesn't come down from the sky, it comes up from the bottom. That's what leadership is about. It's about listening to people, finding out people who have the real things. I'll definitely be listening to Alida Pierce, because I know she won't let me not listen to her, and get things done for this area, for Sooke. There's got to be funding for fisheries, for the Jack Brooks. These things have to happen, but we need a strong voice, and the best voice is one that's inside government and can influence it.
Thank you very much. And Tyson, please.
Canada's system of bourgeois parliamentary democracy wasn't designed to foster constructive and positive cooperation, but to uphold the status quo, as is surely evident in what we've effectively had just one of two parties in power throughout the country's history. Parties which, I'll add, it is difficult to find much serious difference between. We need comprehensive democratic reforms that will not only put parties on equal footing with each other, but also with working class people. Perhaps most obviously, this would include the enactment of mixed member proportional representation. All registered parties should be guaranteed equal treatment, and subsidies for the big business parties should be ended. I would like to see the Broadcast Act amended also to give equal time to all parties, as well as dramatic cuts to spending limits for political parties during and prior to election campaigns, so that voters can make informed choices based on policies, not who had the best financed campaign or who the corporate media was most interested in promoting. This allows leaders to focus on governing and working to build a better society, not campaigning against political adversaries. The enormous wages and pensions for elected officials don't attract leaders, but careerists. MPs make six figures, some over $200,000 or even $300,000 per year. I very strongly believe that no real leaders, in any meaningful sense of the word, could ever accept such wages, while 1 in 5 BC children live in poverty, while 50% of Canadians are only $200 away from bankruptcy, and 39% will never be able to retire. Rather, we should be working to create a system that ensures that our leaders are not being drawn to these positions so they can live like ticks on our scalps, but that the interests of government officials are in harmony with those of working class people. Real leadership is about giving, not taking. It's about sacrifice. That's why my party believes that elected officials should be paid the average Canadian union wage. And let me tell you, when their wages are tied to those of the working class instead of receiving arbitrary wages in the thousands every year, you will see what cooperation looks like, and you will see wages rise. Is a leader someone who wants to make the world a better place for the right price? Or is it someone who would fight no matter what? Someone who would never dream of accepting such obscene wages, so long as even a single person slept on the street or a single child went hungry. I know what kind of leaders I want, driven by a love for truth and justice and equality, and I want a system that will put those people in those positions, not careerists and profiteers. And when we have such a system, we will have the conditions for real leadership and unified action. I have a little time left, so I'm going to try and tell a brief story. In the 1990s, our leader worked with the Green Party, Miguel Figueroa, when the government tried to wipe small parties off the map. We didn't have a seat in government, nor did the Greens at that time, but we still got more done for democratic reform than any of the sitting parties. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Tyson. And Jeremy.
Thank you. This was actually the hardest question for me. The other three questions I was able basically just to quote our platform. But we're a new party, just over a year old, and I think half the country doesn't even know we exist. So I think it's sort of lofty of me to presume I will be able to work with these guys. However, Macron did it in France. Trump did it in the US, so anything's possible. One thing that did occur to me while I was sitting here is my job in the film industry is based on working with others. I'm a grip. People, what do grips do? We modify light and assist in camera movement. I'm part of a crew of 150 people, and as a grip, I have to work with the electrical department, the camera department, the transport department, the art department, the set deck department. All these departments, we come together to make a common goal, although it's only a TV show, not quite relevant to government. However, I am able to work well with others. I'll go to my notes now that I just made a couple hours ago at the 17 Mile Pub, a place I always wanted to visit. The burger was delicious. The People's Party of Canada wants a more unified Canada, and to achieve it, we want to focus on what unites us instead of focusing on what divides us. We will be happy to work with other parties for the betterment of all Canadians. However, we will not compromise our principles. We pride ourselves on being a truly principled party. Our platform has been available for months and it has stayed the same. It has not been adjusted according to the latest polls or whims of society. Some people may disagree with our platform, and we support their right to disagree. That's part of the freedom we enjoy as Canadians. And on a personal note, people say, oh, are you on the right or are you on the left? I don't consider myself either on the right or the left. I'm only available or interested in the best available solution that is supported by the evidence. I don't care where the solution comes from, Liberals, Conservatives, NDPs, Greens, Communists, Independent. As long as it will make life better for Canadians and I won't have to compromise my principles, I will support it. And as an unwhipped party with a free vote, I'm able to do that. Thank you very much.
Okay, so that concludes our questions for this evening. Let's give all the candidates a nice round of applause. And many thanks to all of you for staying with us. The candidates will be out in the foyer should you have any questions you'd like to ask or some more information that you would like to obtain from them. And I just want to give a pitch for the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. If you are looking for a source of nonpartisan information where you can compare one party platform to another, local government elected officials, mayors, councils have gathered an advocacy on behalf of all local governments across Canada, focusing on matters that are important to local government, transit, funding, housing, and the like. So you can go online to buildingbetterlives.ca and you can compare the party platforms, and that's on behalf of local governments. So on that note, have a safe trip home, everyone. A wonderful Thanksgiving weekend with your family and friends. And remember that advanced polls are open this weekend. Thank you very much.
Finally got to hear you talk.
Maya, thank you very much.
Mine to the very end. Thank you so much.
Well. Thank you, Randall.
Yeah, glad you're on stage.
Oh, got there. Well done, Tyson. Well done.
Nice to see you.